Hello, cyclocross friends. Thanks for tuning in to what your dad goes on about when he goes on about cyclocross. And let me explain before we get into my conversation with Joan. Before last season started, I think in September is when I have this conversation with Joan Hanscom. And at that time, I was thinking about a lot of the same things that we've been kind of thinking about lately, just the state of the sport, the aging of the sport, the history of cyclocross in the US, and some of the things that I think an older generation that I'm a part of talk about a lot that may mean nothing to those who are racing now, who are in their teens and their 20s. So how this first came about is I wanted to do this video series, and it was just going to be smaller segments, maybe 10-15 minutes long, just kind of hitting the highlights of where we were 10, 15, 20 years ago in cyclocross, and these things that were monumental at the time that have now maybe slipped into the annals of cyclocross history. Once I talked to Joan and had this, I think, really great conversation about the history of the USGP, I kind of put it on a back burner, and the season started, and I got kind of consumed by CXTV and other things, and only now I'm coming back and revisiting this conversation and thinking about this project again. And now it's moved more from a video essay to what is more consistent with what we do on Cyclocross Radio, with just longer conversations. So I'm putting this out as a podcast on the Cyclocross Radio feed and also on YouTube. So that's kind of where we're at. And the title, what your dad goes on about when he goes on about cyclocross, it could be your mom, it could be your uncle, it could be your coach or your aunt or your older sister or whomever else. I was looking at it from my own perspective. So being a dad, that's kind of where the title came from. And I thought it was kind of funny. Yeah. So this first episode, Joan Hanscom was one of the race organizers, along with Bruce Fina, who started the USGP, the US Gran Prix of Cyclocross, which was a national series, big money, all of the top riders, and really has remained the benchmark for what a cyclocross series can look like in the US. It definitely had its detractors, but at the same time, I think it was the best version of what we've had to date in the US for cyclocross. And it's something that we're always hearing about, going back to a national series. And this is kind of the cyclocross race on a hill that people look to for what a series can be. But there are a lot of things that have to happen if we were to do that again. For one thing, they owned all of the races. They had a lot of industry backing, until they didn't. And you can kind of see with the end of the USGP how it's kind of it's spiraled into where we are now for cyclocross. So that's it. So this is the first episode. I have some other irons in the fire that I'm going to roll out here in the coming weeks or months. But I sat on this one too long. It's a really good conversation with Joan. The audio gets a little crackly in a couple places, but just bear with it. It's a wonderful conversation. And if you don't really know, if you've heard the USGP, but you're really not sure what that means, this is a great primer, and also just a great look back into that time in US cyclocross, including the World Championships in Louisville as well. Okay. What your dad goes on about when he goes on about cyclocross, episode 1 with Joan Hanscom. Let's do that right now. All right, Joan, thank you so much for joining me to talk about the USGP. It is something that I think that for, well, the conceit of what I'm doing is that it's kind of like the things your dad goes on about when he goes on about cyclocross.
Now I feel old.
Yeah, you and me both. And there's a whole generation out there that I mean, we're talking, 2004 when this thing started, and 2012 when it ended. There are people racing who weren't alive when the USGP was going on, which is wild to say. But
yes, that whole generation now pitches me for gravel sponsorships.
Exactly. But it is still out there, and it is still in the zeitgeist of, this was a national series, and this, arguably may have been the last time we had a legitimate national series. So I just wanted to really, since it was your series, I wanted to sort of start from the beginning and just maybe even just give a little background about yourself, and then we'll jump into the USGP specifically.
Yeah. So I started working in the bike industry in 2002. I was a race director at the now long gone Philly Week. That's how I started. So I dove straight in from Cat 4 racing to Philly Week event directing, or one of the event directors, just because I loved bike racing, and I had a long history in event work and project management, and I somehow convinced them that they should hire me, even though I had no clue what to do. So I found myself working in bike racing, which was great. And
for people, I mean, more history here. So for people who don't remember Philly Week and that race, even just, can you just tell, because right now I think we have like the Maryland Cycling Classic, and that may be the biggest U.S. sort of international race that's out there, but Philly was something else.
Philly was massive. So Philly, when I started, was 3 days. It was Trenton, New Jersey, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then the big finale on the Parkway in Philadelphia. And they'd get between like 700,000 and 1 million people to come out and line the streets in Philadelphia. And it was a party. The crowds were deep on the Manayunk Wall. Like, they were lining the Parkway. We had all the big international teams, like the biggest and best international teams, coming to race. And it named the pro champ for the year for the US. And so it was massive. I think it was the biggest one-day road race in the US. And the same promoters also put on a race in San Francisco called the San Francisco Gran Prix, which was also equally crazy and, equally huge crowds. But it was big one-day racing. Think about it as like our spring classics would be the equivalent. So live TV coverage, tape to tape. And we had TV coverage on I think it was the Outdoor Life Network back in the day, which has gone through many, many iterations now. It's probably Peacock now, if I was to guess. But yeah, so it was the biggest show in bike racing when I started. And it was really cool to work for it.
Yeah. All right. So I got you off a little
tangent
here, but yeah, so back to it after working with Philly, the Philly Week.
So I, along with a number of my colleagues, sort of spun off into our own event production company called G4 Productions. And that was Robin Morton, Alice Armstrong, and Kristen Saratani-Reese. And we started our own little production company thinking we'd do some bike racing things. And one of the first people who called us, I think he's probably the second client we had, was Bruce Fina. And Bruce had been the brain power behind the concept of the US Gran Prix of Cyclocross. Bruce started it and sort of drinking beers in a bar in Monopoly after the World Championships. He had been managing the US cyclocross team. I don't even know how he got roped into that job, but he was managing the US team when they went over to Europe to race the World Championships. And he was, as legend has it, he was sitting in a bar having a beer with Charles Pelkey, who was at Velo News at the time. And they were bemoaning the fact that the U.S. athletes were just getting their teeth kicked in. And over the course of that evening of drinks, they decided what was really needed was head-to-head competition. For U.S. athletes to perform better, they needed to compete against each other on a regular basis and have stakes in these competitions. Because at the time, there was nothing organized. The old Super Cup had been defunct for a few years at that point. Todd Wells and Mark Gullickson were the big stars of U.S. cyclocross at the time. And they were racing and scoring lots of UCI points for each other, but they were never racing against each other because there just wasn't anything to bring everybody together. And so this idea was born to make a national series, and sort of encourage all the top players to come together and race against each other in a head-to-head way, week in, week out, to essentially try to raise the game of US cyclocross. And that was the real genesis of USGP when Bruce kicked it off in partnership with Velo News. Essentially, he did a lot of the right foundational work to make it a thing. He got Velo News on board, so he had a media partner right away because he knew that was going to be important for telling the story of the series, but also to get the athletes to come so that they get the media coverage that their sponsors needed. He was really smart in how he conceived of it in the beginning, but it was also at that point a series of independently owned races, and he got the right race promoters involved, the best cross races involved, and sort of loosely tied together in what is essentially a marketing overlay of a series to kick it off. And that's sort of where we came in with G4. Was he wanted to raise its profile. He wanted to make it more of an event. He wanted to make it more, polished, more of a brand. And the G4 girls and I had a lot of experience doing that. And so he reached out to us and said, "Hey, would you get involved and try to help me get this thing more organized?" And so for the first year that I was involved, he reached out to us in the early winter of 2006. So maybe February timeframe of 2006. So that my first season of cyclocross with Bruce was that fall of 2006 season. And we definitely learned a lot that first season. And the other women from G4 decided it was not their bag, and I was hooked. And so I decided to throw all the way in on cyclocross and try to do something with Bruce that was audacious. And that's what we did, I think. We decided that some of the things that were holding us back in those early seasons were things like sponsor conflicts. You had one race that was sponsored by Power Bar, but the national series had a sponsorship by Cliff Bar. Brands like that tend not to play super nice together. One event had Mavic as a sponsor. We had SRAM. So there was just these conflicts between the local race organizer and the national sort of marketing overlay that made it really hard to make it a real proper series. And that's when I was like, no, we've got to own the event so that we can have that uniform brand experience at every USGP. It's got to be the same sponsors. It's got to be the same look and feel. It's got to be the same staff. It's got to be the same voice. And that was where we made that pivot after the 2006-07 season. The following year, we took ownership of all of the events. And I think that's when it really started to sing and really started to feel like a true national series, because it looked the same. We had the same signage at every venue. We had the same sponsors at every venue. And then the most fun part about that was it became sort of this traveling circus where for September through December, every 3 weeks, we saw all of our favorite people every venue. And it was just a sort of a magical, special time because everybody was going. And we had categories for the series that weren't just the elites. So we had the Masters men's category, and that 35 plus category back in the day was fierce. So it was, but that sort of added to that traveling circus, thing of every 3 weeks we got the band back together and we put on a bike race and a party, and then we'd meet up again 3 more weeks somewhere else, and it was great.
This was truly a national series, since you had races in Oregon and Washington, and then you also had races in Massachusetts, and you had races in Ohio, in Colorado, Wisconsin.
Louisville. Yeah, New Jersey for a while. Yeah, we really tried to touch all the markets, and that was actually really important for us, that identity of touching all of the areas of the country. There wasn't much UCI racing on the West Coast, for example. And so if there was really talented West Coast athlete, they weren't getting any UCI points to maybe be eligible to go race overseas, get that world selection, because they didn't have a place to get the points. And so we felt it was really important, because I think you have to remember the whole reason USGP started was because we wanted to make the U.S. athletes better. Bruce was just some random guy living in Austria. He just cared about making it a thing. He didn't have great big dreams of being a bike race promoter in the U.S. He just wanted to make things better. I was the silly one with the dreams about being a race promoter. But, he really did, like, the whole thing that drove it forward was trying to reach all the different regions with that UCI footprint.
Yeah, and that's it's still an issue that we're facing today with trying to have more of a presence on the West Coast with no UCI races there. But I think one of the differences between today and when the USGP was going on, I mean, first off, was just the number of UCI races in the country. I mean, how many were there, and were there any that were not part of the USGP?
Yeah, there were tons.
Okay.
I mean, I think at one point, but they were all C2s, right? And they were all much smaller in terms of attendance and participation. I mean, some of them, because back in the day, people did UCI races just because they could. Like,
yeah, by the end, I think we were in that time like where we had like 3 on the same weekend.
Yeah. And I think that was, at one point there was up to something like 40 UCI races on the calendar in the US. I mean, the calendar got insane. And for good or for bad, the federation never offered anybody sort of date protection, right? So it always became this game of whack-a-mole, trying to find the dates and have events. When you do events, it's really, event equity is a thing, right? Like year in, year out. And you sort of want to own your weekend because that's the weekend that the community the race is in thinks that race is going to happen. And you're trying to slot your race into that community's broader calendar. And maybe your event can't move, but maybe you have another event that happens in a town where college football is really big, and their event has to sort of ping pong around the calendar based around that football calendar. That made the calendar management really a challenging thing. And so I think that was always something that we were up against in the heyday of cross, because there was just so much cyclocross racing happening.
Right. And the benefit of the USGP is that you had the buy-in of the riders that they wanted to race against the best. You all had a system, prize money, everything else, that they knew they were going to get a certain level of competition. So everybody went to your races. And how many weekends was it? How many races or events were in a typical USGP season?
So we would have liked to have more, but there was the UCI restriction on series size, and that comes into the story later down the path. But the UCI limited, a UCI series could not exceed 8 dates because they didn't want any series to be bigger than the World Cup. And so there was a restriction on the number of events that you could have in a UCI series, even though, arguably the footprint that we were trying to create a series in, just landmass wise in North America, was far bigger than the tiny little Benelux region that they were trying to put the World Cup on in Europe. Much smaller, tighter footprints. For us, I don't think having a 10 event series would have challenged the World Cup. It just would have allowed us to bring it to more markets in the US, but they were very opposed to that idea.
Yeah.
So we were an 8 event series.
And I think the biggest thing that you all were able to achieve that is impressive and I can't fathom happening again is the ownership part. And can you just talk about a little bit just about how you were able to convince the promoters to basically give up ownership of their events and let you come in there and run them? Because we've seen series after that where it's the same thing that was happening in those first couple of years of the USGP, where it's like, hey, we'll put up signage, we'll have it'll all be the same kind of branding, but every race is different. And you're right, different sponsors and just a different feel, where you were able to come in there, gain ownership of these events, and just have one consistent look and feel for every race.
Well, to be fair, though, we didn't get them all on board. And so we asked everybody that was originally on the schedule. We said, hey, do you want to? And some said yes and some said no. And you have to respect the people who said no. That was their event. That was their baby. They wanted to keep it. So that's where we started to expand into different markets that maybe we wouldn't have gone to otherwise. And so, yeah, as events said no, we found new venues that really became one of sort of our driving ways of looking at markets. Was we only wanted to go where we were wanted, right? You never want to try to bring an event into a town where they don't want you, because you just won't ever get traction. And so that was where we ended up in Louisville, Kentucky, where people, Stu Thorne, the legendary Stu Thorne, I think initially thought we were insane for going to Kentucky. But we had done our research and we knew that there was a great sort of sleeper cycling community there and a really great cross thing with the Ohio Valley Cyclocross. And we also knew it was within driving distance of Chicago, where there was also a lot of cyclocross. And so people thought we were nuts for going to Kentucky, but it ended up being pretty great. And I think long term, Kentucky's done a lot with cyclocross. I mean, how many national championships have they hosted since the USGP left? I mean, they've really embraced the sport there on a major way.
Yeah, I think
that was because the
Louisville
USGP went there.
I think Louisville may be like one of the only venue in the U.S. that's had a national championship, a Pan American championship, and a world championship all in the same city.
Yeah, I mean, they were fantastic. They were such good partners. But, we went there because they wanted us, and all the credit in the world to the sports commission in Louisville for getting it, for seeing this weird little sport and saying, yeah, we'll go for that. We're like, yeah, we want that. So, but that was really a key thing that we did with the USGP. I mean, it was the same when we went to Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. It was the same when we went to Fort Collins, Colorado. These are places that wanted us. And we did a number of years in Portland, Oregon, until it just became too expensive. And then we moved to Bend. But we went to Bend because Bend wanted us. And Bend was terrific for that same reason. These are all communities that ultimately said, we really want this sport to come to us. And so that was really important for the success of the series, because we had partners on the ground in every region that wanted us there.
So as far as the rider buy-in, I mean, you still had riders who, were your goal in this, Bruce's goal in starting this thing was to lift up American cyclocross. It's something that we're still working with today. And what did it take to get those riders to say, hey, this is something that we all want to participate in and that we're all going to be at every stop for the USGP?
I think part of it was there was guaranteed media coverage, right? So they knew their sponsors were getting the media coverage that they wanted. A lot of the times their sponsors were our sponsors. And so their sponsors were saying, hey, nope, this is the event. We want you there. And so there was the sponsor pressure. There was the media coverage, which was really important. But then there was also the level of execution. We were executing those events on a very high level. I think, look, I've raced a lot of bikes myself. You want to go to an event that's well produced. You want to go to an event that is going to be well organized. You want to go to an event that's going to offer you what you need as a bike racer. And we tried very, very, very hard to deliver that, whether it was in the Cat 4 race at 8 a.m. or if it was in the elite race at 4 p.m. And so I think that was all part of it. And that was really key to the brand as well. Like Brad Ross taught us that, he was adamant that every single customer have the proper USGP experience. And we took that to heart. So I think that's why the athletes came. It was the media, it was the sponsors, it was that traveling circus. But they also, I think, deep down, athletes want to win against the best, right? I mean, I think that, back in the day when it was Tim Johnson and Jeremy Powers racing against Ryan Chabon and Barry Wicks, like those guys wanted to race each other, because they wanted to be the best. They wanted to be good enough to go over to Europe and compete. And I think they all bought into the idea that the only way you get better is if you race against better athletes as well. And certainly, I think we saw it bear very early fruit on the women's side because of how much support we offered to the women's field. We had, I think, during the USGP years, everybody thinks about the Dutch now, and the Dutch have always been good. I'm not trying to say we were like super better than the Dutch, but like we had a ton of women who were competing at a very, very high level, who were going over to Europe and routinely having top 10 World Cup finishes or podiums at the World Championships. I think that, we have something to say that we helped raise that level for the women in particular here by the head-to-head competition for one, but by making it pay properly for the women to come race together as well. They could make a real living racing cyclocross then.
Yeah, it was also great that you had a team like Luna that was predominantly a mountain bike team, but bought into cyclocross. And that was just so 100%. Huge for the women's field. And also, I mean, some of the greatest cyclocross racers that we've seen and were able to hold their own in Europe.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'll put Katarina in there as an American racer also, even though she's Czech.
Yeah, we count her. But yeah, I mean, I think that was why I think you have to give the athletes a lot of credit too. They didn't want to just go cherry pick points somewhere else. They wanted to race against the best because they knew that would make them better when they went over to Europe to race.
And so it starts in 2004, you come in on 2006, it gets to about 2012, and then things start going a little sideways there. Can you just tell, sort of go into the history of what happened?
Sure. In April 2009, we sort of got the, hey, you guys want to put on a world championships? And we were like, yeah, all right, and we were awarded that world's bid in 2010. And, we became really focused on pulling off that first world championships to ever happen, essentially outside of Europe. We were going to do it in Louisville, Kentucky, but it's really expensive. And we thought we had signed the dream sponsor, who shall be unnamed. But that dream sponsor agreed to sponsor both the USGP and the World Championships, along with some teams and some other events. And then they decided not to pay their bills. And so it was probably the scariest year of my life, because you don't want to fail on this global scale, and you don't want to stiff your friends who've been working for you, who you owe money to. You don't want to let everybody down, all the athletes down who have worked so hard for a home country world championships. I mean, it was hell. It was honestly it was hell what we went through when the money didn't come. It was August. I was home in New Hampshire visiting my parents. I knew we didn't have the money to run that 2012 season of the USGP because we hadn't gotten paid. And I essentially sat at the beach in New Hampshire and started calling sponsors saying we're going to have to pull the pin. And I called Velo News and I'd let them know, but they hadn't run the story yet. And, it was heartbreaking. And then Alex Wassman from SRAM made a miracle. Alex was called Trek and said, can you cover this thing? And then he called all of our other sponsors and said, can you increase your contribution? And they all did.
Yeah. No, I know. It's just such a huge part of your life and commitment, and also building this amazing thing and being able to save it at least for that last year was huge. And I mean, yeah, it's wild. It's still emotional now. I mean, it's still such a big part of your life, even though it's been 13 years since it last raced.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce and I say it all the time. We would still be going if we'd had the money. It was hard.
Yeah.
So the world came and went. That was crazy. The floods and the, squishing all of it into one day, which I think ultimately made a really great World Championship day. The party was insane. The racing was immaculate. I mean, you couldn't have had better world champions.
Greatest day of U.S. cyclocross ever. I mean, I am so happy that I was there and was able to witness it all and the craziness of all of it, and just it remains one of the greatest days.
Remember. I remember standing on that behind the start line in the start grid, and the men are all lined up, and you have all of Belgium across the front row. And I remember I looked up at the sky and I thought, God, is Space Lab going to come land on us? Where are the asteroids? I was just waiting for a disaster because it had been so fraught. Everything. I mean, the fact that they built temporary dams to hold the water back is long enough to pull off the bike race. And I don't think people understand how hard. I mean, we had 300 sewer department workers building a dam to hold back the Ohio River
while the race was going on. They're down there throwing sandbags on it.
It was insane. I wonder. I went down at one point into the field, and I splurged and I bought these really fancy rubber boots to wear for the World Championships. And I remember walking down into the pits and then towards where the river was, and the water was coming over the toes of my boots. And I was just like, oh God, start the bike race.
And it's just, and it all, the consolidated Saturday, which was such a crazy and such a great day. And it all went off in just such iconic performances. You got Sven winning. We got to see Matthew Vanderpool win when he was just a child, out there, just stuff like that.
Wout.
Yeah, and little Wout was out, just amazing stuff. And then you go back to that venue on Sunday, and it's underwater,
completely underwater. And Sven was like, "Oh, you made the right choice." And I was like, Yep. Like we weren't faking it. We weren't lying.
And you had all of Europe, you had all of Belgium saying, fly them all back, we'll have them here. And, but no, you're able to pull it off, which is sort of goes into my, the next part of the story. And I mean, that you were able to have that one last year of the USGP, but just, just how we're talking about, how you're getting emotional about it, how I, remember that event and just the pinnacle of American cyclocross right there, just all of this momentum, and then not being able to take full advantage of that.
Yeah.
I think sort of put us where we are today. Not to put that on your shoulders, but I'm just saying that,
you wouldn't be the
all
first.
of those events together.
You wouldn't be the first. Yeah, it was afterwards, it was over. I had every intention of the next season of the USGP starting back up. It wasn't intended to stop there. But what had become abundantly clear was that all of the sponsors who had rallied were going to sort of reset to their previous levels of sponsorship or less. And I don't blame them, right? They really rallied to save us. And I am forever grateful. I could list every single one of those people by name till this day who did that. But they all wanted it to keep going. None of them wanted to invest more, again, understandably so, but they also wanted it to be bigger. And one of the questions you had asked was about, being a national series. Well, non-endemic marketing departments, if you're talking about, let's call them real businesses, not bike industry businesses, non-endemic marketing departments don't really think you're a national level series unless you're in 6 to 8 cities. And we were in 4. And we were in 4 because you could only have 8 UCI races in a series. And so we started looking at things like, well, could we just do 1 UCI race each weekend and go to 6 cities or go to 8 cities? And that was something that, I dug deep on, and I had site visits in California, and I was fully committed to try to make happen. And we had some potential partners involved who wanted to host events. But if you go to 8 cities, it costs a lot. And the money wasn't following. It just became exhausting to try to pull it off. It was just me and Bruce. And Bruce lived in Austria. So it was just me sort of alone in my apartment every day working on cyclocross and calling Bruce and, trying desperately to figure out how we'd keep it alive. And it just became untenable. Bruce described it as burnout. I sort of say, well, I just couldn't keep having my poor parents pay for my health insurance. There was, this is a funny story. It's a sad story. In 2010, I went for a run before I was supposed to fly home to visit my parents for Christmas. And I fell out for my run, and I fell and I cracked the orbital bone in my face. And I'd done it dodging this baby carriage. And the guy pushing the baby carriage was an emergency room trauma doctor. And he looked at my face and he said, "Ooh, you have to go to the hospital and you need a CAT scan because you broke your orbital bone." And I was like, well, shit, I have a flight to catch. And the pain was a lot. So I took his advice and I went and I got the CAT scan. And like 3 months later, I get the bill for the CAT scan. And with insurance, the bill for the CAT scan was $10,000. I was like, shit, I am never, ever going to be able to pay this bill. And I turned it over, and there was a number on the back and said, if you are unable to pay this bill, call this number. And so I called the number, and the nice lady that answered was like, well, can you email me over a copy of your tax returns, and I'll see if you qualify for financial aid. And I sent her my tax returns, which I had made, I'm not ashamed to admit it, $8,000 the year before. And she was just like, oh, yeah, I know you don't have to pay this. On the phone, she just was like, yeah, no, you're good. Don't worry about it. And and I remember I had other promoters demanding that we open our checkbook and show them how much money we were making because they thought we were minting money with the USGP. And I always thought, well, if I could share with you my $8,000 tax return, you might think differently. And all of that $8,000 was usually done on like little contracting side gigs I picked up during the winter time or the summer when I was running my side hustle.
That's just, yeah, it's untenable, and it's amazing that you did it for that long, and it's such a huge, yeah.
But that was the level of commitment it took to pull it off, right? Like to be able to run a national series, to be connected with all of your regional partners full time, to service your sponsors, to have the media piece the media piece was so important. To have the media piece running, all of that stuff isn't something that you can just decide to pull out of a hat 3 weeks before the event happens. That was it. To do a true national series at that level required full-time work. I mean, that's why Bruce couldn't do it from Austria by himself, right? That's why he needed partners, because it was full-time work to just organize the staff and book the travel and reach out to the athletes and, keep the PR going. Like, all of that is a full-time job. You can't do it, like I said, a couple of weeks before the event happens and hope to have the reach and the punch that we wanted it to have. So somebody had to do it.
Yeah, no, just to give people an idea, if it's okay to share at this point, I mean, what did it cost? What was your budget to put on this series for the year?
I think on average, and remember we were moving signage all across the country. We had announcers, you have to pay the UCI prize list, the UCI inscriptions, all the permit fees, all the stuff. If memory serves, and I will admit I did not open up the budget for this conversation, it was between like $160,000 and $170,000 per weekend to pull off what we pulled off, and that includes paying our staff, all of the stuff, because we even had the same staff, right, and that traveled with us, because we wanted to make sure that the timing guy was the same timing guy and the same timing system. And we really wanted that consistency of experience across all of the events. And so, you're flying in staff, we didn't put the course up overnight. It took us a week to put the course in. Well, that's hotels for a week. It was expensive. And then, at the time, and it's gotten a bit better, we were paying equal prize money to the women 30 places deep in the C1 races. So what we were spending in prize money was a lot more than most promoters were at the time. Some people were catching on and doing the equal prize money for the podium or equal prize money for the top 10, but we were the first one that matched men's prize list full depth of field for both. And so that was just extra money too. And every city cost a little bit different. Some were more affordable than others, but yeah, it was usually between that 160, 170 range per event weekend.
Yeah, and that's something worth pointing out, because I think that for people who are racing now, who are much younger, who on the women and men field are just used to having equal payout, that was not a thing, and bizarrely it was something that people just accepted as okay, that the women's field made less, so that you were a pioneer in that, even though it's just adding that much cost was another just great step forward that I think led to a lot of races. And I think we can credit the US beyond the USGP as being
100%.
pioneers in that, and saying, no, we're paying equal pay, to the women and men's fields. And I think that did start with what you all were doing.
100%. And I want to give a lot of credit to Katerina and Georgia on that one as well, because they were very loud voices in all of that and sort of demanded it, and good for them. They were really big leaders in that forefront, and the Europeans didn't follow suit for a long time.
Yeah, they're still kicking and screaming about it.
Yeah.
But I think that the other sort of thing to highlight here is that one of the reasons I want to have this conversation is that a national series is something that people are always still talking about. We have the USCX now, which is a wonderful series. I mean, I'm so happy for Scott Page and John Meehan before him for what they've created, and they're out there doing this. But you can't have a conversation about the USCX without somebody bringing up the USGP, and not everybody knows what that was. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation. But just from what you said a minute ago about what it took to put on that race, in today's money, if you were to do a USGP style national series, you're not doing it under $1 million, right?
I don't see how.
Yeah. And you're also, we're talking about these non-endemic sponsors, and also, SRAM and Trek coming in there and kind of saving the day late on, and having other partners who at the time were a lot more invested in cyclocross than they are now. I think that the money has dried up even for gravel and everything else, but we had a time where it was sort of shifting away from cyclocross. Looking at it now from the outside, do you see any way that something like this could come back?
Sure. I mean, there was a series before us, right? And then I think it went away, and then the USGP came along. I always kind of hoped that somebody would come along sooner. And like you said, much respect to Scott and the rest of the promoters, because Scott's race is beautiful. His event production caliber is so high.
That's Rochester Cyclocross for people who know Scott Page.
Yeah, and his signage is just next level, and I'm a nerd about that stuff, and I'm just like, damn, that's good. Like, it's just next level. They're all doing great things, but the money is hard for sure. I mean, and you have to look like, I just read an article this week about, when the bike industry started launching gravel bikes, they were like, no, they're not cyclocross bikes. And now the conversation is sort of pivoted to, oh yeah, sure, you can ride these for cyclocross, because nobody's, or very few brands are still making a dedicated cyclocross bike. I mean, very few brands. So what does that tell you about the state of the sport? That it's cyclical, right? Everything's cyclical. Gravel's hot now, road will be hot again, cyclocross will swing back around, mountain bike will have another moment, something else will come along. It's cyclical. And so I wouldn't want to say it's impossible, because I don't think it is. I think you just have to have somebody stupid enough to do what I did, or much deeper pockets. Somebody who's, but that's the problem with all cycling, not just cyclocross, right? It's always fueled by passion, and it's fueled by patrons. It's never fueled by good business sense. It's always fueled by somebody who just wants to be a benefactor, and eventually those benefactors go somewhere else.
It's always, and I'm in the same position, but it's always having those conversations with sponsors who always want to bring up ROI, and you have to kind of explain to them, well, look, you're supporting this great sport
here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's I think that my theory that I've sort of spewed here for a while about cycling, especially in the US, we seem to be in a cycle that every discipline gets a decade. Like if you look at mountain biking, like in the 90s in Norba and all that kind of stuff, they had a really good 10 years. And then cyclocross came along, had a really good 10 years. Now it's kind of like moved over to gravel, which I think is sort of coming up on its 10 years. Yeah. So we'll see where it goes next.
I think it's interesting. The thing with cyclocross that always gave me hope is that it's a really good TV product, right? It's really good to watch. And that was part of what got me hooked on it to begin with, was that it's good spectating. You don't need 6 hours to watch and understand a cyclocross race, right? It's good for the attention span. It's good for people who have other things to do with their day besides sit and be glued to the TV. And so that kind of gives me hope that it is a good discipline of cycling to be packaged up and reviewed. And technology's come so much further than when we were doing it and trying to put together those early day live streams when the technology was absolute crap. Now you could do it so much more affordably than we were able to do it. And it would be so much more reliable and such a higher quality, because the technology has just come so far since we were doing it. I think that's part of what will help if you can figure out that whole broadcast side of it. Because I do think there's a market for watching it, but that may be a little pie in the sky. And this is going to sound like I'm bashing gravel, and I'm not. I am not bashing gravel. I enjoy racing gravel myself. I admire the athletes because they're all great athletes, but it is not a good TV product, right? It is watching people ride sort of slowly, semi-fast in a straight line for a really long time. And it takes a real commitment to watch the race. And that again, that's not me bashing gravel. It's just not as compelling a viewing experience as cyclocross is, just from an attention stand point of view, or just available hours in the day span. And so I think it does still have those elements, right? I think people still tune in to watch a lot of cyclocross in the fall. I know I do, because it's a good bit of TV on a cold Sunday morning in the wintertime.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a piece that we will continue to try try to figure out again, because you're right, the technology is better, the costs are less, but it's tough just in this environment even to raise that much to get it done. But Joan, I when I asked if you would do this, I said, "Oh, we'll talk for about 10 minutes on this." And
sorry.
And no, please don't apologize, because I love this. I'm sorry if I brought up some traumatic moments there, but I appreciate you sharing, and I think it really is important, because it's something that, you should know that you created something that is enduring in U.S. cyclocross history and is still talked about today, even though it's gone, hasn't been there for 12, 13 years, and is looked at as a high water mark, for your Louisville, and just a benchmark of what we can do in cyclocross. So I wanted to make sure that people knew the whole story, not just USGP and what was behind it. So thanks for taking the time to relive.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and just appreciate you letting me chat about Bruce too, because he deserves an awful lot of credit. Yeah,
for sure.
He was the idea guy. I was the doer. He was the idea guy.
Yeah, takes a team. So yeah, no, thanks to both of y'all for doing that, and thanks for coming on and chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.